The gun was already drawn when Ella Keller stepped through the door of the Rourke Ranch house, and the man holding it did not lower it when he saw her. She had been told many things about Ezekiel Rourke, that he was brooding, that he was impossible to know, that the last surveyor who had tried to set foot on his land without permission had ridden back to Durango missing a boot and most of his composure. She had been told that he spoke in silences more than words, that his reputation in the San Juan Mountains was built not on friendliness but on a particular, terrifying competence. She had been told all of this, and she had ridden 40 miles through the last warm days of a Colorado October to find him, because none of those things frightened her. What did frighten her just slightly was the look in his eyes. Dark brown, furious, utterly still, the way a mountain lion goes still before it decides whether to move or simply wait you out. "You are on private property," he said. His voice was exactly what she had expected. Low, controlled. The kind of voice that had learned long ago that it did not need to rise to be heard. "I know whose property it is," Ella said. She did not step back. She had not stepped back from anything since she was 16 years old, and her father's surveying equipment had become hers by default and necessity, and she had decided that the frontier either broke you or it made you into something the frontier itself had to reckon with. "I need to speak with you. You can put the gun away." "I decide when the gun gets put away." "Then decide quickly," she said, "because I have traveled a day and a half to get here. My horse needs water and grain, and I have information that is going to prevent you from losing this land to the most sophisticated piece of fraudulent cartographic forgery I have seen in 15 years of professional surveying. So either shoot me and lose the ranch, or put the gun down and let me show you what I found." The silence that followed was the longest kind, the kind that has weight to it. She watched his jaw shift, watched something move behind those dark eyes, and then, very slowly, Ezekiel Rourke lowered his gun. But to understand how Ella Keller came to be standing in that doorway with a leather map case under one arm and the absolute conviction that she was right about everything, you have to go back 6 weeks, to the morning she arrived in the town of Creston, Colorado, in the autumn of 1882. She had come from Denver on the narrow-gauge rail and then by hired horse the final stretch, and the town of Creston sat at the foot of the San Juans like something the mountains had exhaled and not quite finished forming. There was a general store, a telegraph office, a livery, a saloon that doubled as the town's only hotel, a church that leaned slightly to the west as if it had been listening to something in that direction for too long, and a land office with a crooked sign above the door that read Harlan Prescott, land agent. It was the land office that had brought her here. Not Harlan Prescott specifically, but a letter she had received 3 weeks before in Denver, forwarded through 2 intermediary offices, unsigned, containing only a folded survey map and 4 words written in the margin. "Something here is wrong." Ella was a licensed land surveyor and cartographer, one of fewer than a dozen women in the United States in 1882 who held such credentials, and she had earned hers not through inheritance or connection, but through 10 years of field work across 4 territories, an apprenticeship under the great Felix Harwood of the United States Geological Survey, and a natural spatial intelligence that had made her, according to Harwood himself in a letter he had written on her behalf, the finest surveyor he had trained in 30 years. She could read topography the way other people read faces. She understood what the land was actually saying beneath whatever the map claimed it said, and the two were, more often than she liked, in direct conflict. The map in the anonymous letter showed a property boundary line in the San Juan Mountain region. She had looked at it for exactly 4 minutes before she understood what was wrong. The boundary had been shifted, not sloppily, not obviously. Whoever had done it had used the correct instruments, the correct notation, the correct official forms. But they had made one critical error in their calculation of the magnetic declination at that altitude and longitude, and Ella had caught it the way you catch a lie from someone who is almost a perfect liar. Not in the words. In the breath between the words, the property in question, she had determined after cross-referencing with the General Land Office records she kept copies of in her Denver office, belonged to a rancher named Ezekiel Rourke. And according to the forged boundary, he was already 300 acres into land he did not own, which meant that when the territory of Colorado moved to correct the discrepancy, as it surely would before winter, he would stand to lose not just those 300 acres, but the access road to his northern grazing land, which would make the entire upper portion of his ranch economically unworkable. She had not known who Ezekiel Rourke was when she packed her equipment and boarded the train. She had only known that someone had tried to steal his land through forgery, and that she had the means to prove it, and that her particular sense of justice, which was sharp and unyielding and not especially interested in how inconvenient it might be to apply, would not allow her to simply set the matter aside. She learned about him in pieces during her first 2 days in Creston, from Mrs. Della Ford, who ran the saloon's upstairs rooms and served as Ella's landlady for the duration. Ezekiel Rourke. Lord. He comes into town twice a month for supplies, doesn't speak to a soul more than he has to. And last spring, when old Cooper Yates tried to fence off the creek that runs through the south end of Rourke's property, Rourke took the fence apart post by post in broad daylight without saying a single word to anybody, just worked until it was gone, then rode home. Nobody said anything to him. Nobody ever says much to Rourke. From Tom Alcott, the livery owner, while he was seeing to Ella's roan mare the morning after she arrived. Good man, far as I know, runs a clean operation, doesn't gamble, doesn't drink heavily, pays his debts exact. He's had that ranch since he came out of the war, built it up from nothing, which I respect. Lost his wife 4 years back, consumption, hasn't been the same since. Well, he wasn't what you'd call light before that, but after. From the general store owner, a talkative man named Gil Patterson, who offered information freely whether or not you had asked for it. Brooding fellow, impossible to know. His ranch hand, Alvaro, has been with him 8 years, and I'm not sure they've had a full conversation in the last 2. Not mean, just closed up like a vault. You know those vaults they have in banks now, all that steel. That's Rourke. Something in there probably, but good luck getting to it. She had filed each of these descriptions carefully in the part of her mind she reserved for preliminary data. She had also begun, during that second day in Creston, to feel a deep and specific unease about Harlan Prescott. He was a small, dapper man, Prescott, 40 or so, with oiled hair and very clean hands for a frontier land agent, which by itself told her something. He had come to greet her at the saloon the morning after she arrived, which told her something else, because she had not yet introduced herself to anyone in any official capacity, which meant that he had already been watching for her. "Miss Keller," he had said, smiling with all his teeth, "I heard we had a professional land surveyor passing through. What brings you to Creston? Business or pleasure?" "Business," she had said, and given him nothing more, and watched his smile remain fixed in that particular way that told her it was a performance rather than a feeling. She had spent the rest of that day doing what she always did in a new territory. She walked it. Not to survey it, not yet, just to walk it, to let her feet and her eyes develop their own understanding of the landscape before she applied any instruments to it. She walked the streets of Creston. She walked the road leading north toward the mountains. She noted the creek that Tom had mentioned, and she noted something else. A second survey marker, newly placed, not on any map she had seen, driven into the earth about a half-mile north of town at a point that would be critical if someone were making the argument that a boundary had shifted. She pulled it and turned it in her hands. Standard steel survey stake, but the filing notch on the side was wrong. It was made for a different instrument, an older instrument, one that predated the current standard by 15 years. Someone had used equipment from the 1860s to place a marker meant to look like a modern official survey, and they had not known or had not cared that the notch would give it away to anyone who had spent enough time holding survey stakes to recognize the difference immediately. She put it in her saddlebag. That night, Back in her room at the saloon, she spread out every document she had brought with her and began to build the picture properly. She had the original General Land Office survey from 1874, when Ezekiel Rourke had filed his claim. She had the forged boundary map from the anonymous letter. She had her own field notes from the day's walk, and she had the mismatched stake. She worked by lamplight until after midnight, because this was what she did when a problem had teeth. She did not sleep until she understood every angle of it, and by the time she finally lay down, she understood this one well enough to be angry. The plan, as she reconstructed it, was elegant in its fundamentals and criminally fraudulent in its execution. Someone, and she was developing strong suspicions about who, had created a backdated boundary survey purporting to correct an error in Rourke's original 1874 filing. The fraudulent survey moved his eastern boundary west by enough to strip 300 acres from his claim. It had been filed with the Territorial Land Office in Denver 2 months ago. If Rourke did not challenge it within the statutory period, which was approaching, the new boundary would be formalized, and the stripped land would become available for new claim. And she would bet every instrument in her kit on who was waiting to file that new claim. She presented herself at the land office the following morning at 9 o'clock. Prescott was there. He was also, she noted, surprised to see her, which meant he had expected her to spend her time in Creston doing something other than this. "Miss Keller," he said, "what can I do for you?" "I would like to see the filed survey for the Rourke property," she said. "The most recent filing. Now, what would bring you to an interest in that particular property?" "Professional curiosity," she said. He showed it to her. He had to, it was a public record, and refusing would have announced guilt more clearly than a signed confession. She looked at it for exactly the amount of time she needed, which was not long, and she noted everything she needed to note, and she thanked him pleasantly and left. She was back in her room within 20 minutes and adding to her documentation. By noon, she had the complete picture. The forged survey contained not just the magnetic declination error she had caught from the letter. It also showed a triangulation reference point that she knew from the 1874 original had been recorded in the wrong position by 2 degrees. The forger had copied the error, which meant they had copied from the original rather than conducted a new survey, which was a second and devastating proof of forgery. No surveyor who had actually stood on that land would have reproduced that error. You had to stand on the land. You had to look at it. If you did, you knew where things were, and where they were did not match what the forged document said. She was packing her equipment to ride to the Rourke ranch the next morning when Della knocked on her door. "There is a man downstairs asking about you," Della said. She was a pragmatic woman of 50 who had seen enough frontier trouble to recognize its particular early smell. "Not Prescott. One of his people, I think. Rough-looking. He was asking Gil Patterson whether you had been to the land office." Ella looked at Della. "Thank you," she said. "You be careful, Miss Keller." "I am always careful," Ella said, which was true. She was also always armed, which she did not mention but which was also true. The Colt revolver she had carried for the last 8 years was in its holster on her hip under her riding coat, and she was an excellent shot, because if you spent a decade alone in remote territories with survey equipment and cash, you either became an excellent shot or you became a cautionary story told over dinner in Denver. She left Creston before dawn the next morning, taking the northern road into the mountains, and she arrived at the Rourke ranch in the early afternoon with the map case under her arm and the gun under her coat, and as it turned out, Ezekiel Rourke's revolver pointed at her face inside the first 30 seconds. After he lowered the gun, he did not immediately say anything else. He just watched her with that mountain lion stillness, and she noted that he was exactly what she had been told, physically speaking, and slightly more than what she had been told in terms of the sheer contained force of his presence. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been built by weather and decision rather than ease. His hands were a working man's hands. The gun went back into the holster with the ease of long practice. "Come inside," he said finally, not warmly, but not with hostility either. With the flat directness of a man who had decided to give you 3 minutes to prove you were worth the interruption, and who would tell you the moment those 3 minutes were up. She came inside. The ranch house was clean and spare. No excess, no decoration except a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece that she did not look at directly out of respect for what she already suspected it was. There was a work table, 2 chairs, a fireplace that was burning low, and bookshelves that held more volumes than she would have expected, which she noted with interest. A man who read. She revised her preliminary estimate of him upward. She set the map case on the work table and opened it and laid out her documents in order. "Your name is Ella Keller," he said. It was not a question. She glanced up. "How do you know that?" "I have a friend in Denver," he said, "at the General Land Office. He sent me a letter last month telling me someone had filed a boundary correction on my property. He also told me he had forwarded a copy of the suspicious survey to a private cartographer in the city who had a reputation for identifying fraudulent work. He said her name was Ella Keller." He paused. "I did not expect you to come here in person." She processed this. "Your friend in Denver. Is his name Aldous Webb?" Something shifted in Rourke's expression, just barely. "Yes. Aldous Webb sent me the anonymous letter," Ella said. "He did not sign it because he was worried about retaliation if someone at the office had been bought. That was wise of him." She looked at the documents. "He sent you a warning and me the evidence. Between the two of us we have everything we need." "Show me," Rourke said. She showed him. She took him through it systematically, the way she took anyone through a complex survey analysis, with precision and without condescension. She showed him the magnetic declination error, explaining in clear terms why it proved the survey had been done with either a faulty instrument or without actually standing on the land. She showed him the triangulation reference discrepancy, and watched him lean forward slightly when she explained that the original 1874 survey had recorded that reference point incorrectly, and that the forgery had reproduced the exact wrong measurement, which could only happen if someone had copied from the original document rather than conducting actual field work. "If they had surveyed it," she said, "they would have seen that the creek bends 12 feet east of where the original filing says it does. Every surveyor who comes to this land sees it, because the creek is right there and the discrepancy is obvious in the field. Whoever forged this document never came here. They sat in an office and copied numbers, and they did not know they were copying a mistake." Ezekiel Rourke had been standing at her shoulder, looking at the documents, and she was very conscious of his proximity, the warmth of him, the way he smelled of wood smoke and clean work, and she focused firmly on the documents because she had not ridden 40 miles to be distracted by a man's proximity. "Prescott," he said. It was not a question either. "I believe so. I cannot prove the forgery traces to him specifically without a handwriting analysis, but the circumstantial logic is compelling. He would have access to the original 1874 filing through the land office. He would have motive because if your eastern boundary moves west by 300 acres, that land becomes available for new claim, and he is in a position to file that claim before anyone else knows to. There is a railroad spur being planned," Rourke said quietly. "Eastern approach. If the survey is correct, it runs straight through those 300 acres. Ella stopped. She looked at him. "Railroad money. Substantial railroad money," he said. "The Denver and Rio Grande is surveying a spur through this range for the silver mines. The land values along that corridor are going to be significant." Now the full shape of it was visible. It was not just the ranch that Prescott wanted. It was the railroad corridor running through it, the value of which would dwarf the value of the grazing land by an order of magnitude. This was not a minor land grab. This was a theft that would have cost Rourke not just 300 acres but, in all practical terms, the future of everything he had built. "We need to get to Denver," she said. With these documents, I can file a formal challenge to the boundary correction on your behalf with supporting technical evidence. There is a statutory window and we are inside it, but not by much. How long to reach the rail station at Durango? 2 days hard ride, he said, or 1.5 if we push. We, she said, and looked at him directly. He looked back. There was a long pause. You said we. You cannot file the technical challenge yourself. You need a licensed surveyor to certify the analysis. I am the licensed surveyor. She began rolling the documents carefully. And I would very much prefer not to travel alone with evidence this sensitive after someone was already asking about me in Creston this morning. Something moved through his expression again, that barely perceptible shift. Not quite alarm, but adjacent to it. Someone was asking about you. Prescott has already noticed my interest in his land office records. He will not wait indefinitely before deciding to act. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my ranch hand Alvaro can manage here for a week. I will need an hour to prepare. Take 2, she said. I need to rest my horse. He nodded once and moved toward the door, and then he stopped and turned back, and she saw him look at her with something that was not yet warmth but was the very earliest precursor of it, the recognition that someone was exactly what they appeared to be rather than something you had to armor yourself against. Thank you, he said, for coming here. She met his eyes. The land was stolen from you. Someone had to say so. The ride to Durango took 2 days. She had expected the silence to be oppressive, because she had been told he was a man of silences, but what she found instead was that his silences were not empty. They were occupied. He was a man who thought continuously and spoke only when he had something worth saying, and she found this so refreshing after years of men who talked constantly to prove they were confident that she began to relax into the rhythm of it almost immediately. He was knowledgeable about the land in a way that she found genuinely impressive. On the second morning, when they were navigating a rocky stretch that her own sense of the terrain told her was not quite as described by the road signs, he said quietly, there is a better line east of here, about a 1/4 mile. The road floods this time of year. I should have said so earlier. She had already been calculating the eastern option. Yes, she said, I was wondering about the drainage here. He looked at her with a slight shift of his expression that she was beginning to learn. It meant he was reassessing something. You can read the drainage from the surface. The vegetation pattern, she said. The willows cluster there, and see the way the sedge grass runs in that line. Water moves through here when there is any significant rain. When did this road last flood? 3 weeks ago, he said. Then the ground is still saturated enough that if it rains tonight, and I believe it will, this stretch will be impassable by morning. He was quiet for a moment. You read the weather from the vegetation as well. Partly. Partly from the barometric pressure. I carry a barometer. She pulled the small instrument from her coat pocket and showed him. She had had it since her apprenticeship under Felix Harwood. It was a beautiful little thing, brass and mahogany, and it had never been wrong about a Colorado mountain storm in her 10 years of carrying it. He took the eastern route without arguing, and they camped that night in a sheltered spot under a rock overhang, and it rained, hard and cold, exactly as she had said it would. She was already dry inside her bedroll when she heard him say, in the darkness, "You were right about the rain." "I usually am," she said, not boastfully, just factually. It was the kind of statement that would have annoyed her if someone else had said it to her, except that she already knew it was true, and she had learned that pretending otherwise was not humility. It was a different kind of dishonesty. There was a pause, and then she heard something extraordinary. A sound that she would later identify as Ezekiel Rourke almost laughing. Not quite, but almost. The restraint of a man who had stopped laughing easily somewhere along the line and had not entirely remembered how to start again, but who had been reminded that it was possible. "What made you a surveyor?" he asked. This was the most personal question he had asked her in 2 days, and she took it seriously. "My father was a surveyor. He died when I was 16, a fall in the field. His equipment came to me because I was the only one who knew how to use it. I had been going out with him since I was 11. She paused. I also have very good spatial reasoning. My father always said it. I can look at a landscape and know how it fits together in 3 dimensions without needing to consciously work it out. It is simply how I see. Gifted, he said. Trained, she corrected. And then gifted, perhaps. The training comes first. Another pause. Then, my father had a cattle ranch in Texas. He wanted me to inherit it. I went to the war instead. She waited. She had learned in these 2 days that he offered information in pieces and that waiting was more likely to produce the next piece than asking for it. After the war, he said, I could not go back to Texas. There was too much of before the war in Texas. I came to Colorado and built something that was entirely mine without any of the weight of before. He was quiet. The land here is hard. The winters are killing. But it is mine in a way that nothing else has ever been. She understood this precisely. She understood it the way you understand something that maps directly onto your own experience. She too had built something entirely her own, built it from her father's tools and her own intelligence and 10 years of hard work in territories that did not expect her to be doing what she was doing. She too had something that was hers without any dilution. We are going to protect it, she said. He did not answer immediately. Then, yes. They reached Durango the next afternoon and caught the train to Denver the morning after. 2 days on the narrow gauge, through mountain passes that Ella tracked automatically with her interior compass, making small notations in the field book she always carried, her mind partially occupied with the landscape and partially, increasingly, occupied with the man sitting across from her. He was reading. He had produced a book from his saddlebag, a volume of Tennyson's poetry which she had not expected, and she did not say so, but she felt the unexpected piece of information settle into the picture she was building of him. Not a man who announced himself. A man you had to look at carefully to see. She found herself looking at him carefully. On the second day of the train journey, when the passes had given way to the lower plains, and the light was the flat gold of late afternoon, he looked up from his book and found her looking at him, and held her gaze without looking away. The moment lasted several seconds, and said a number of things that neither of them had the words for yet, and then she looked back at her field book and he looked back at Tennyson, and neither of them mentioned it. They arrived in Denver on the 22nd of October, 1882, and Ella went directly to the General Land Office. The clerk at the reception desk looked at her with the expression she had encountered in every official office she had ever entered, the one that said, I do not believe you are supposed to be here, and I am going to need to find a man to deal with you. She took her credentials from her case and laid them on the counter one by one, slowly, with the patience of a woman who had done this enough times to find it more exhausting than infuriating mostly. I am Ella Keller, licensed land surveyor and cartographer, number 47 in the Colorado Territory, she said. I have a formal challenge to file against a boundary correction submitted 2 months ago on the Rourke property in the Creston district. I require the forms for a technical dispute filing, and I require the original 1874 survey records pulled from archive. I believe there are statutory deadlines involved, and I would like to begin immediately. The clerk pulled the forms. People generally pulled the forms when she used that voice. Ezekiel Rourke stood beside her at the counter, and she was aware of his presence in a way that was partly practical, because she was glad of having 6 feet of formidable, clearly capable man beside her in this context, and partly something else that she continued to file carefully under later. Aldous Webb, when he was summoned, turned out to be a small, energetic man in his 60s with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had been waiting anxiously for exactly this moment. He pumped Rourke's hand and then turned to Ella with the expression of someone meeting someone whose work they greatly admired. Miss Keller, he said, you caught the declination error. And the triangulation discrepancy, she said, his eyes lit. You caught that as well. Excellent. I thought I might be imagining it. You were not imagining it. Whoever forged this document copied from the original filing directly without conducting field work. The creek position is wrong on the forged survey by 12 feet, which any surveyor who stood on the land would know immediately. This is the proof that no actual survey was conducted." Webb sat down heavily, with the relief of a man who has been carrying a secret for too long. "I found the filing 2 months ago and knew immediately it was wrong, but I could not prove the mechanism. I did not know about the creek." "I went there," Ella said simply. She spent the next 3 days in the archive room of the General Land Office, preparing the formal technical challenge. She worked with the methodical intensity that hard problems demanded from her, building the argument layer by layer, cross-referencing survey records from across the district to establish the baseline standards against which the forged document failed. Ezekiel Rourke came and went, dealing with the legal aspects of the challenge through a Denver attorney that Aldous Webb recommended, and each evening they met for dinner at the hotel where they were separately staying. Those dinners were, looking back later, the most important conversations of her life. The barriers that travel and emergency had partially lowered, the walls that he had built over years of closing himself up against the world, they did not fall down. They did not need to fall down. What happened instead was that she found the door in the wall and he, almost without deciding to, opened it. He talked to her about the war, not the battles but the time between battles, the way the land of Virginia had looked in the early morning when it was temporarily not a battlefield, the way he had coped with the aftermath by making himself useful and purposeful because purposeless grief was something he could not survive. She talked to him about Felix Harwood, about the years of her apprenticeship, about the particular loneliness of being the only woman in every professional room she entered, and the discipline she had developed of simply being so good at the work that the objections eventually ran out of oxygen. He talked to her about his wife, Claire. She had been sick for 2 years before she died, and he had known it was coming and had been unable to stop it. And the helplessness of that had been the worst thing he had ever survived, worse than anything in the war, because in the war you could fight, and with Claire he could only watch. Ella listened without trying to fill the silence around it. She simply received what he offered and held it carefully, the way you handle a precise instrument that you know has taken years to make. On the third evening at dinner he said, "You are the first person I have talked to like this since Claire." She considered her response for a moment. "I understand that is significant," she said. "I do not take it lightly." "No," he said. "I did not think you would." He looked at her across the dinner table in the warm gaslit dining room of a decent Denver hotel, and what she saw in his expression was not the closed vault that Gil Patterson had described. It was something open, something slightly raw and entirely real, and she felt the specific internal shift that she had been carefully not acknowledging for 6 days rearrange itself into something she could no longer catalog under later. On the 4th day, the challenge was filed. Webb and the attorney both reviewed Ella's technical documentation and declared it, independently and with considerable enthusiasm, the most thorough and airtight survey fraud analysis they had encountered. "The boundary correction will be suspended pending review," the attorney said. "Given the strength of the technical evidence, I would estimate a formal ruling in your favor within 30 to 60 days, Mr. Rourke." "And Prescott?" Rourke asked. "The forgery evidence will be referred to the territorial marshal. This is a federal offense, filing a fraudulent land survey. He will face criminal charges." Ella thought of Prescott's very clean hands and his smile made of performance rather than feeling, and she felt a grim satisfaction that was not quite vengeance but was adjacent to justice. They left Denver on the 26th of October and began the ride back toward the San Juans. The train to Durango, then horses north. The weather was shifting. She could see it in the sky, feel it in the barometer she checked each morning. The first snow of the season was coming. The San Juans never waited long. On the train back south, something had changed between them. The conversations in Denver had done something that could not be undone, and they both knew it, and the awareness of it sat between them with a warmth that was distinct from the cold outside the train windows. "You should stay at the ranch," he said when they were an hour out of Durango. He said it to the window rather than to her, which she recognized as a man saying something he was not entirely sure he should say. She looked at him. "For how long?" "Until the ruling comes. Until we know the matter is settled." "I have space." He paused. "It is also, I think, going to snow within the week, and the road back to Creston will be difficult." She examined the proposal with the same systematic attention she gave everything. She could return to Creston. She could return to Denver. Both were reasonable. She had other clients, other work waiting. And yet the thing that felt most right, with the absolute clarity that important truths tend to arrive with, was staying. "I have a commission I am working on for the USGS," she said. "A topographic survey of the eastern San Juan range. I could conduct it from your area as well as from anywhere. I would need space to work and access to the terrain." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I have more land than I can use," he said, "and a room that has been empty for 4 years." The last part was said very quietly, and it meant more than it appeared to mean, and they both understood that. "All right," she said. The ride from Durango to the Rourke Ranch took the full 2 days because the weather had closed in cold and heavy, and on the second afternoon the sky had the white-gray weight of imminent snow. She read it in the barometer, in the behavior of the birds, in the way the wind had turned. Tonight, she thought, or tomorrow morning at the latest. It was tomorrow morning. She woke in the spare room of the Rourke Ranch house in the gray pre-dawn to the absolute silence that only happens when snow is falling, and she lay still for a moment listening to it. And then she got up and went to the window and saw the first snow of 1882 covering the San Juan Valley in white. She heard him in the kitchen, the sound of a fire being built up, the clank of a coffee pot. She dressed and went to the door between the rooms and knocked once. "Come in," he said. The kitchen was warm. He was at the stove with his back to her, and the first snow was falling past the window behind him, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him with the knowledge that she understood him completely. This man that everyone else had called impossible to know, understood him in the way that you understand a landscape you have walked in every direction and at every hour. He turned and saw her looking at him, and he was very still for a moment, the way he went still when something mattered. "It snowed," she said. "Yes," he said. She crossed the kitchen and stood beside him at the stove, and he handed her a cup of coffee, and their fingers touched in the handoff, and neither of them moved away from that brief contact. And then he set his cup down very carefully and turned to face her fully. "Ella," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without any prefix. "Yes," she said, and she said it to mean several things at once, which he understood, because he had spent 6 weeks learning to understand how she communicated the same way she had spent 6 weeks learning to understand him. He raised his hand and very slowly touched her face, his thumb along her cheekbone, a question that waited for her response, and she leaned into it just slightly, which was her answer. And then he kissed her carefully, the way a man kisses someone he has waited a long time to have and does not want to rush, the way a man kisses someone he intends to kiss again. Outside, the snow fell on the San Juan Mountains, covering the altered markers and the forged boundary lines and the stolen ground, covering everything that had been wrong with a clean white that would wait for the truth to emerge from underneath. She pulled back first, just enough to look at him. His eyes were open, dark and still, and the closed-up vault quality was entirely gone, replaced by something unguarded and real that she thought probably very few people in the last 4 years had been allowed to see. "I am not," she said quietly, "a woman who does things halfway." The corner of his mouth shifted, that almost laugh. "No," he said, "I know that." "This will be complicated," she said. "I have work, I travel. I'm not the kind of woman who stops her work for anyone. I would not ask you to, and I am not asking you to stop being who you are. The land, the silence, the way you have built your life here, I understand what that is and I respect it." "I know you do," he said. He looked at her steadily. "You are the first person who has ever understood this place the way I understand it, The way the land works, the way the space matters." He paused. "I did not expect to find that." "Neither did I," she said honestly. He kissed her again, and this time she did not pull back to assess anything. She simply stayed in it, his hands in her hair, the warmth of the stove at her back and the snow outside, and the absolute rightness of being exactly where she was with exactly this person. The weeks that followed were the most unusual and the most natural of Ella Keller's adult life. She had thought that staying at the Rourke Ranch would feel like a concession of some kind, a pause in her real life, but instead it felt more like her real life than anything had felt in years. She worked every clear day, heading out into the eastern San Juan range with her equipment, conducting the USGS topographic survey she had described on the train. And the land was extraordinary work, genuinely complex terrain with an elevation variation that challenged her instruments and her skill in equal measure. Ezekiel Rourke, to her consistent surprise and delight, was not only not threatened by her expertise but was actively and specifically interested in it. He began to accompany her on survey days, not to help. He did not try to take over or manage, but because he was curious, and because he had 40 years of knowledge about this particular landscape that turned out to complement her technical analysis beautifully. There was one morning that she would remember for the rest of her life. She was attempting to establish a triangulation reference point on the ridge above his northern pasture, a calculation that required holding 3 measurements simultaneously in the mind while adjusting for the curvature of the slope, which was a problem that even experienced surveyors found difficult because the numbers were counterintuitive until you understood the underlying geometry. She was working it out on paper and muttering to herself, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she had not seen him use before, pure, undisguised astonishment. "What?" she said. "You are doing all of that in your head," he said. "I watched you. You barely looked at the paper." "The paper is for verification," she said. "The calculation happens first." He stared at her. "Felix Harwood trained you." "Yes." Harwood mapped the Colorado River tributaries for the government survey in 1875. His triangulation work is what the entire Southwestern Territory grid is built on. She blinked. "You know Harwood's work." "I know the survey documentation for every government survey conducted in this territory since I bought this land," he said. "Because this land is mine and I have made it my business to know everything about it." He paused. "I have read Harwood's published methodologies. I could not have done what you just did if you gave me a week." The way he said it, without diminishment, without the awkwardness that most men her age brought to acknowledging her competence, just clean, honest admiration. It went somewhere in her chest that she had not known needed touching. She looked down at her field book to recover herself. "He was an excellent teacher," she said. "You are an extraordinary surveyor," he said, flatly, like a statement of geographic fact. "It is not only the training." She kept her eyes on the field book for another moment, and then she looked up, because she owed him the honesty of meeting his eyes when he said something true. "Thank you," she said. "I am not flattering you," he said. "I am stating what I observed." "I know," she said. "That is why I am thanking you." They worked the ridge for another 2 hours in the comfortable silence that had become their shared language, and on the ride back down in the late afternoon, when the sun was already dropping behind the western peaks and the temperature was falling fast, he reached across the distance between their horses and touched her hand briefly, and that was enough. November deepened. The snow on the mountains became permanent, the passes beginning to close, the days shortening toward their winter minimum. News came from Denver twice, once from the attorney confirming that the boundary correction had been formally suspended pending review, and once from Aldous Webb informing them that a territorial marshal had been dispatched to Creston to take Harlan Prescott into custody on charges of land, survey fraud and filing false federal documents. Prescott, it emerged, had not waited. He had received word that the challenge had been filed, and he had attempted to leave Creston before the marshal arrived. He had not managed it. The marshal had caught him 2 hours north of town on the Durango Road, in the first heavy snowfall of the season. He had been returned to Denver in chains, and his trial was expected in the spring. She read this letter at the kitchen table and felt the complete architecture of the fraud collapse, all the hidden motives and the falsified records and the stolen markers, and the 300 acres of future that someone had tried to take from this man. It all resolved into an ending that was right. Rourke read the letter standing beside her, his hand resting on the table near hers, and when he finished reading he looked at her and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You saved this ranch." "We saved it," she said. "Your friend Webb sent the letter. You knew the land. I had the technical knowledge. It required all of us. You are very careful about sharing credit," he observed, sitting down across from her. "I am very careful about being accurate," she corrected, "which is not the same thing but produces similar behavior." That almost laugh again, except this time it went all the way. It became an actual laugh, quiet and rusty with disuse but completely real, and she felt something vast and warm open up in the middle of her chest because she had, without trying and while doing everything else, given that back to him. "Ella," he said. "Ezekiel," she said. He looked at her with the full, open, unguarded expression that had first appeared on the morning of the first snow, and had been appearing more easily, more often every day since. "Stay," he said. "Not stay until the ruling, not stay through the winter, just stay." She held his gaze and felt the full weight of what he was asking and what she would be answering. She had built her independence deliberately and maintained it through years of difficulty because it was real and necessary, and she would not give it up. She also knew, with the precision she brought to every analysis, that loving this man and continuing to be fully herself were not in conflict. She had watched them for 6 weeks. She had tested the compatibility the way you test a triangulation reference from multiple angles at different elevations under different conditions. It held up. "What does staying look like?" she asked. He thought about it seriously, which was one of the things she loved about him. He did not answer immediately with whatever would satisfy. He considered. "It looks like your work continuing," he said. "Your USGS commission, whatever comes next. I know you travel. I know this is not a woman who stays in one place." He paused. "But it looks like you coming back. It looks like this being the place you come back to." "And you?" she asked. "What do you need?" "I need to know that this is real," he said simply. "That I have not been wrong about what has been happening between us. Because I have not been wrong about many things in my life, but I have also not been the kind of man who was skilled at this." "You have not been wrong," she said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "And you are more skilled at this than you know. You simply needed to do it with the right person." He turned his hand under hers and held it, and the fire in the stove was warm, and the snow was heavy on the mountains outside, and she looked at this man that everyone had told her was impossible to know and thought, "I know him completely. I knew him before the first snow fell, and I know him better now, and I will know him better still, because knowing him is the most interesting, most rewarding survey I have ever undertaken, and I intend to keep working." She said, "Yes, I will stay." He brought her hand to his lips, and she felt the warmth of it through every careful layer she had built around herself over 29 years of doing things alone, and she let it through completely, because she had chosen to let it through, and that was different. December came with serious cold and serious snow, and they were together inside it. She continued her USGS work on the days the weather allowed, and spent the indoor days on documentation and correspondence, and he managed the ranch through the winter routines that he knew by heart. And in the evenings they read by the fire. His Tennyson and her Felix Harwood's published survey methodologies, and occasionally he read to her from Tennyson, and occasionally she showed him something in a survey diagram that she found genuinely beautiful in the way that complex mathematics can be beautiful. And he looked at it and said that he could see it, that it was. Alvaro, the ranch hand, was a compact and observant man of about 45 who had been with Rourke for 8 years, and who had, in those 8 years, developed an extremely accurate read of his employer. He observed the change in Rourke with a quiet and satisfied attention and said nothing about it to anyone, which was Alvaro's particular gift. He was simply glad of it, in the way that loyal people are glad when someone they care about stops being alone. He told Ella once, in passing, when they happened to both be in the barn at the same moment, and he was seeing to her mare, that he had not heard Rourke laugh before November. He said it without drama, as an informational offering, and went back to what he was doing, and Ella filed it in the place where she kept the things about Ezekiel Rourke that she was still adding to. Christmas, which in 1882 fell on a Monday, was quiet at the ranch the way everything there was quiet, not empty but restrained. And Ella had been in correspondence with her sister in Denver, her only close family, and had managed to have a package delivered via the Durango mail that arrived, somewhat miraculously, 2 days before. She had got him a compass. Not just any compass, but a Schmalkalder surveying compass she had found in a Denver instrument shop before she left, fine brass, beautifully made, calibrated to a precision that a man who had spent years studying the survey documentation for his land would appreciate. She had had his initials engraved on the lid. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, which she had learned meant he was feeling something he did not yet have the word for. Then he said, "I will use this every day." "I know you will," she said. "That is why I chose it." He had got her a field book. Leather-bound, thick-paged, the kind she preferred for field work, and inside the front cover he had written in his careful hand, "For the survey of everything you have not yet mapped. This land, in particular, will hold your work as long as you want to give it." She read it twice, and then pressed the cover closed with both hands and held it, and he watched her with the open expression that was his now, that she had watched open up through October and November and December, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a closed person opens. Not explosively, not all at once, but carefully and deliberately, and with the full intention that comes from choosing rather than being forced. The territorial ruling came in January, delivered by a courier from Durango who made the trip on a clear, cold day between storms. The boundary challenge was upheld in full. The forged survey was declared void. The original 1874 boundary of the Rourke property was confirmed as the legal boundary of record. The 300 acres were never in question again. The railroad spur survey, which proceeded through the spring, confirmed that the corridor ran through those acres precisely as Rourke had suspected, and the land value attached to that corridor would, over the following decade, make the Rourke ranch not merely sustainable but genuinely prosperous. Harlan Prescott was tried in Denver in April of 1883 and convicted on 2 counts of federal land fraud and 1 count of attempting to file a false federal document. He was sentenced to 5 years in the federal penitentiary at Canyon City. His land office license was permanently revoked. The land agent office in Creston was taken over by a man named Elias Cord, who had been the deputy marshal at Durango, and who turned out to be fair, methodical, and almost aggressively honest about document integrity. Aldous Webb received a formal commendation from the Territorial Commissioner's office for his role in identifying the fraudulent filing. He framed it and hung it above his desk and was quietly delighted about it for several months. Ezekiel Rourke proposed to Ella Keller on a February evening in 1883 in the kitchen of the ranch house during a snowstorm that had kept them inside for 3 days and which showed no particular signs of stopping. He did not do it grandly. He was not a grand man. He did it by setting down the book he was reading and looking at her across the table where she was working on her USGS survey documentation and saying, with the particular directness that was his deepest nature, "Ella, will you marry me?" She looked up from the documentation. She looked at him for a long moment. "You are not asking," she said. "No," he agreed. "I am telling you what I want and asking whether you want it as well." My work will not stop, she said. My travel will not stop. The USGS commission is not the only one. There will be others. I will sometimes be away for weeks at a time. I know, he said. I am not asking you to be less than you are. I will want space to work when I am here. Real space, not a corner of the kitchen. I will build you a proper survey office, he said. Off the east side of the house with windows on 3 sides for the light, she processed this. You have thought about this for some time. Since November, he said. Approximately since the morning I watched you run triangulation mathematics in your head on the North Ridge. She almost laughed. She let herself laugh. You fell in love with me because of triangulation mathematics. I fell in love with you, he said, because you are the most completely yourself person I have ever met, because you do not pretend, because you see this land the way I see it, because you told me the truth when you could have managed me and you never managed me once. He paused. And yes, also the triangulation mathematics. She held his gaze for another moment and then she said, Yes, Ezekiel, I will marry you. He crossed to her in 3 steps and she stood, and he held her in the way she had discovered he held things he valued, completely and carefully and without any performance in it, just the real thing, solid and certain. Good, he said into her hair, and she felt the word through the whole of her. They were married in the Creston Church, the one that leaned slightly to the west, on the 28th of March, 1883. It was a clear day, cold still but with the first suggestion of spring underneath, and the San Juan Mountains were white and enormous to the north, and the ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Thomas Alcott, younger brother of Tom at the livery, which Ella found pleasantly circular in the way that small frontier towns arrange their own narrative neatness. Della Ford attended and cried, which she did unashamedly, and which she would have been embarrassed about if anyone had mentioned it, so no one did. Alvaro attended and stood very still and looked as moved as a man of his particular reserve could look, which was considerably moved if you knew how to read it, and Ella, who had spent months learning to read contained people, knew exactly. Aldous Webb made the trip from Denver and was, characteristically, energetically delighted about everything. Her sister, Catherine Keller, came from Denver as well, and spent the evening before the wedding in Ella's room at Della's establishment, and said over a glass of decent wine that had made its way to Creston via the general store, "He is not what I expected when you described him in your letters." "What did you expect?" Ella asked. "I expected someone more." Catherine searched for the word. "Manageable." Ella considered this. "He is not manageable," she agreed. "But he is honest and he is kind and he respects me completely and he is interesting and he makes me feel like exactly who I am is exactly right." She paused. "That is considerably better than manageable." Catherine looked at her for a moment. "You love him." "Thoroughly," Ella said. "Then I am very glad," Catherine said, and meant it. The wedding itself was brief and real, the way both of them wanted things. They had written their own words, because neither of them was comfortable with formality for its own sake, and what they said to each other was simple and true and specifically them. She said, "I know who you are, and I choose you with that knowledge and I will keep learning you for the rest of my life." He said, "You showed me that what I had built was worth protecting. You are the best of what I want to protect. I will stand beside you in everything." No one in the church said anything for a moment after, because the room had that particular weight that gathers when something genuine has just been spoken in a space. People are used to receiving performances. Then the Reverend said, "By the authority of God and the territory of Colorado, I declare you married." And Ezekiel Rourke kissed his wife with a quietness and a certainty that matched everything else about him. And Della Ford cried without shame. And Alvaro nodded once with the gravity of a man who has been hoping for something for years and has finally received it. They went back to the ranch that evening, the two of them together on the road through the returning spring, and the mountains were pink and gold in the last light, and she rode beside him with her hand on her new field book and the brass compass in his coat pocket, and the knowledge that every map she made from here forward would include this land as its center. Months passed, and the warmth came back to the San Juans, and Ella completed her USGS topographic commission and submitted it to the survey office in Denver, where it was received with considerable enthusiasm. The chief surveyor of the Colorado USGS office wrote to her personally to say that her triangulation methodology for high-elevation terrain was the most accurate he had seen and would be adopted as the standard for future mountain surveys in the territory. She read this letter at the survey office Ezekiel had built her on the east side of the ranch house, with windows on 3 sides exactly as he had promised, and she felt a satisfaction that was complete and particular, the satisfaction of work done well and fully recognized. She showed him the letter. He read it and handed it back and said, "Of course," which was exactly what she wanted, neither excessive enthusiasm nor deflection, just the plain acknowledgement of what was true. She was in the field when she realized she was pregnant. She was measuring an elevation reference point on the western slope above the north pasture in July, with the summer heat giving everything in the mountains a particular golden shimmer, and she sat down on a rock to make a calculation and understood, with the same spatial intelligence that told her how landscapes fit together in 3 dimensions, that something inside her had changed its configuration. She finished the measurement. She made her notations. She rode home. She told him that evening. He was very still for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "I am usually certain," she said. Something moved through his expression that was the deepest kind of feeling, the kind that does not have a word because it is too large for a single word, a composite of love and fear and hope, and the particular awe of knowing that something enormous and irreversible has just become real. He said, very quietly, "Thank you." "It is not a gift I gave you exclusively," she said. "It required both of us." "Ella," he said, "thank you." She understood then that he was not thanking her for the pregnancy specifically. He was thanking her for all of it. For riding 40 miles with a map case under her arm. For standing in the doorway of a man who had a gun on her and refusing to step back. For knowing him when he had made himself almost entirely unknowable. For staying. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and he put his hands on her face and held it gently, the way he held everything he valued, and she felt the rightness of it from the center of herself outward. "You are welcome," she said. Their son was born in March of 1884, on a clear, cold morning very much like the morning they had first seen the snow falling together, and Alvaro rode to Creston and back in impressive time to bring the midwife, Mrs. Hargrove, who was a stout and capable woman who had delivered half the children in the district, and who took to Ella with great efficiency, and no patience for alarm. The boy was healthy and loud and dark-haired, and Rourke held him with the terrified care of a man who is strong enough to do anything and has just discovered something he is afraid of dropping, and Ella watched him from the bed, exhausted and completely awake, and thought that she had never seen him so entirely present in his face as in this moment. "His name," Rourke said, not looking up from the baby. "Felix," Ella said. "For Harwood, if you don't mind." He looked up. "Felix Rourke," he said. He nodded slowly. "That is a good name." "I thought so," she said. Felix Rourke was, from the beginning, a child who occupied space with remarkable confidence, which Ella attributed partly to nature and partly to the fact that both his parents had spent their adult lives doing exactly that. He was curious about the land from the moment he could walk it, following his father through the pastures with the serious attention of a small person absorbing a large education, and following his mother to the survey office to look at the maps with an intensity that she recognized immediately as her own. She took him out on his first real field survey when he was 4, a short expedition to a reference point a quarter mile from the house, and she showed him how the compass worked and what it measured and why, and he held the compass in both small hands and looked at it with absolute concentration, and she felt something move in her chest that was the particular joy of giving someone a world they did not know existed. Rourke, watching from a few steps back, caught her eye and smiled. A real smile, the full kind, which he gave now without the rust and restraint that had been there at the beginning, Because 4 years of genuine happiness have a way of dismantling the mechanisms you built to protect yourself from the absence of it. She smiled back. The second child came in 1886, a girl they named Catherine after Ella's sister, who was so pleased about this that she came from Denver for 2 months to help and ended up being genuinely useful and not at all in the way, which was the best possible outcome. Catherine Rourke had her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular spatial intensity, and grew up knowing by the age of 3 exactly where she was in relation to everything else, a navigational certainty that Ella recognized as a gift. The Rourke Ranch had, by 1886, been significantly transformed by the prosperity that the railroad corridor land values had produced. The ranch house had been expanded properly. The survey office was now a well-equipped room with proper drafting tables and shelving for map cases. And the northern grazing land, which had been the land most threatened by Prescott's forgery, was some of the most productive in the district. Ella's professional practice had grown as well. She had a second major USGS commission and had taken on a private client work in the district, and her reputation in the cartographic community was by now firmly established. Several colleagues from the survey community in Denver had visited the ranch over the years, initially surprised to find that the best surveyor in the Colorado Territory was conducting her practice from a remote ranch house in the San Juans, and then, once they had spent time there, understanding completely why. She was standing at her survey table one autumn afternoon in October of 1886, exactly 4 years after she had first arrived in Creston, working on a topographic map of the Eastern Range, when she heard him come into the survey office behind her. She did not turn around. She knew his step, had known it within the first month, could tell by the weight and pace of it what he was thinking. He came to stand beside her and looked at the map. "You remember what day it is," she said. "October 14th, he said. 4 years. 4 years, she agreed. "You arrived on a horse," he said, "with a map case and a gun under your coat." "You had your gun already drawn," she reminded him. "I was not expecting someone like you." She looked at the map and then at him. "No one ever is," she said, without arrogance, just with the simple truth of a woman who had spent her whole life being something people had not expected to encounter. He reached past her and put his finger on the eastern boundary line of the survey map she was working on. "What is here?" he asked. "A new reference point. There is a rock formation on the East Ridge that gives a perfect triangulation anchor for the whole upper range. I found it last week." "Show me tomorrow," he said. "All right." He moved behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him slightly, and they looked at the map together in the afternoon light coming through the 3-sided windows. And outside, the children were somewhere in the yard with Alvaro, whose infinite patience had extended seamlessly to the next generation, and the mountains were enormous and permanent around them, and the land that someone had tried to steal was theirs, documented and defended and fully known. "I was told you were impossible to know," she said. "You were told wrong," he said. "I knew that before I got here," she said. "I suspected it anyway. Anyone who builds something this good in this place has to have enough inside them to be knowable if you know how to look." He was quiet for a moment and then, "You knew how to look." "I always know how to look," she said. "It is my fundamental skill." She felt him press a kiss to the top of her head, and she smiled at the map, at the lines she had drawn that showed where things actually were as opposed to where anyone had tried to falsely claim they were. "Ezekiel," she said. "Ella," he said. "I am glad I rode 40 miles to knock on a door belonging to a man with a gun. I am glad you did not step back." "I never step back," she said. "No," he said, "you never do. That is one of the things I love most about you." She turned to face him, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 4 years, with the full and open attention of a man who had been closed for a long time, and had opened specifically and completely for her. And she thought of everything that had happened between that first moment in the doorway and this one. The fraudulent maps and the midnight archive work and the train through the mountains and the first snow, and the Christmas compass, and the wedding in the leaning church in Felix and Catherine, and every day of work and every evening by the fire, and every conversation that had built them into what they were. She put her hand against his face, the same gesture he had first made toward her on the morning of the first snow, a question and an answer at once. "Let us go see where the children have gotten to," she said. "In a moment," he said, and kissed her, thoroughly and without any hurry, the way a man kisses someone he is certain of, which is the best way and the most real way. And outside the mountains stood their ground, and the land was documented and safe in theirs. And inside the survey office the maps were accurate and signed by the finest cartographer in the Colorado Territory, who had found, in the act of saving someone's land, that she had found her own place in it as well. She walked out into the October afternoon with him, into the golden mountain light, and Felix came running across the yard with a stick he had been using as something, a fence post or a survey stake or a weapon against imaginary threats, and Catherine toddled behind him with Alvaro's patient hand on her shoulder, and the mountains were turning the colors they turned in late October, the pines dark against the paler aspens. And the sky above the San Juans was the particular deep blue that only happens at high altitude in autumn when the air is cold and entirely clear. She stood beside her husband in front of the house he had built and the land he had saved and the life that had opened up between them, and she thought, this is what it looks like when the survey is complete. Not an ending, because surveys are not endings. You always come back, always find new reference points, always discover that the terrain has more in it than the previous map was able to show. But this is what it looks like when you have walked the land in every direction, and at every hour, and you know exactly what you have, and it is more than you expected, and it is yours. Felix ran to her and she caught him, and he was warm and vigorous and smelled of outside, and she held him against her side and looked at the mountains. Rourke put his hand at the small of her back. She leaned into it, exactly as she had leaned into his first touch, with the full and deliberate weight of someone who has decided, and who is not given to half decisions. The first snow of 1886 would come within the week. She could already feel it in the barometer in her coat pocket, in the temperature of the air, in the way the high peaks had taken on their winter look. She was not worried about it. She had measured these mountains in every season, had slept in them in the rain and the cold and the impossible summer heat, had mapped them with more accuracy than anyone before her, and she knew them. She also knew the man beside her in the same way, from every angle and at every elevation, completely and without reservation. And she knew that what they had built together was more solid than anything she had ever surveyed or mapped or measured, because the most important things cannot be measured. They can only be known. And she had known him before the first snow fell, and she knew him still, and would keep knowing him, because that was the nature of her particular gift. She always went back, she always found more, and the territory, if it was good territory, always had more to give. It was good territory, the very best.